Japan's military-dominated government had long been preparing for its quest. Over decades, it had crafted a muscular, technologically sophisticated army and navy, and through a military-run school system that relentlessly and violently drilled children on the nation's imperial destiny, it had shaped its people for war. Finally, through intense indoctrination, beatings, and desensitization, its army cultivated and celebrated extreme brutality in its soldiers. Imbuing violence with holy meaning, wrote the historian Iris Chang, the Japanese Imperial Army made violence a cultural imperative, every bit as powerful as that which propelled Europeans during the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. Chang cited a 1933 speech by a Japanese general. Every single bullet must be charged with the imperial way, and the end of every bayonet must have national virtue burnt into it. In 1931, Japan tested the waters, invading the Chinese province of Manchuria and setting up a fiercely oppressive puppet state. This was only the beginning. In the late 1930s, both Germany and Japan were ready to move. It was Japan that struck first, in 1937, sending its armies smashing into the rest of China. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Poland. America, long isolationist, found itself pulled into both conflicts. In Europe, its allies lay in Hitler's path. In the Pacific, its longtime ally China was being ravaged by the Japanese, and its territories of Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and Midway, as well as its Commonwealth of the Philippines, were threatened. The world was falling into catastrophe. On a dark day in April 1940, Louis returned to his bungalow to find the USC campus buzzing. Hitler had unleashed his blitzkrieg across Europe, his Soviet allies had followed, and the continent had exploded into total war. Finland, which was set to host the Summer Games, was reeling. Helsinki's Olympic Stadium was partially collapsed, toppled by Soviet bombs. Gunnar Hökert, who had beaten Louis and won gold for Finland in the 5,000 in Berlin, was dead, killed defending his homeland. The Olympics had been cancelled. Louis was unmoored. He became ill, first with food poisoning, then with pleurisy. His speed abandoned him, and he lost race after race. When USC's spring semester ended, he collected his class ring and left campus. He was a few credits short of a degree, but he had all of 1941 to make them up. He took a job as a welder at the Lockheed Air Corporation and mourned his lost Olympics. As Louis worked through the summer of 40, America slid toward war. In Europe, Hitler had driven the British and their allies into the sea at Dunkirk. In the Pacific, Japan was tearing through China and moving into Indochina. In an effort to stop Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt imposed ever-increasing embargoes on materiel, such as scrap metal and aviation fuel. In the coming months, he would declare an oil embargo, freeze Japanese assets in America, and finally declare a total trade embargo. Japan pushed on. Lockheed was on a war footing, punching out aircraft for the Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force. From the hangar where he worked, Louis could see P-38 fighters cruising overhead. Ever since his trip in the air as a boy, he'd been uneasy about planes, but watching the P-38s, he felt a pull. He was still feeling it in September when Congress enacted a draft bill. Those who enlisted prior to being drafted could choose their service branch. In early 1941, Louis joined the Army Air Corps. Sent to the Hancock College of Aeronautics in Santa Maria, California, Louis learned that flying a plane was nothing like watching it from the ground. He was jittery and dogged by air sickness. He washed out of the Air Corps, signed papers that he didn't bother to read, and got a job as a movie extra. He was working on the set of They Died with Their Boots On, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, when a letter arrived. He'd been drafted. The induction date fell before the Flynn film would wrap, and Louis stood to earn a bonus if he stayed through the shoot. Just before his Army physical, he ate a fistful of candy bars. Thanks to the consequent soaring blood sugar, he failed the physical. Ordered to return a few days later to retake the test, he went back to the set and earned his bonus. Then, on September 29th, he joined the Army. When he finished basic training, he had an unhappy surprise. Because he hadn't read his Air Corps washout papers, he had no idea that he'd agreed to rejoin the Corps for future service. In November 1941, he arrived at Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. The military was going to make him a bombardier. That fall, while Louis was on his way to becoming an airman, an urgent letter landed on the desk of J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. It had come from a brigadier general at the War Department, Military Intelligence Division. The letter said that a credible informant had warned military officials that a California man, believed to be working for an innocuous local Japanese organization, had in fact been an employee of the Japanese Navy, on assignment to raise money for Japan's war effort. Japanese naval superiors had recently transferred the man to Washington, D.C., the informant said, to continue acting under their orders. According to the informant, the man was known as Mr. Sasaki. It was Louis's friend, Jimmy. Though the surviving records of the informant's report contain no details of Sasaki's alleged activities, according to notes made later by a captain of the Torrance Police, Sasaki had been making visits to a field adjacent to a power station just off Torrance Boulevard. There he had erected a powerful radio transmitter, which he had used to send information to the Japanese government. If the allegation was true, it would explain Sasaki's mysterious trips to Torrance. Louis's good friend may have been a spy. Sasaki had indeed moved to Washington, D.C., in the employ of the Japanese Navy. He worked in the Japanese embassy and lived in an apartment building popular among congressmen. He made himself well known among the Washington elite, mixing with legislators at building cocktail parties, playing golf at the Army-Navy Country Club, socializing with police officers and State Department officials, and volunteering to serve as chauffeur after parties. Just whose side he was on is unclear. At a cocktail party, he gave a congressman sensitive information on Japanese aircraft manufacturing. The letter to the FBI set off alarm bells. Hoover, concerned enough to plan on informing the Secretary of State, ordered an immediate investigation of Sasaki. Not long after sunrise on a Sunday in December, a pilot guided a small plane over the Pacific. Below him, the dark sea gave way to a strand of white, waves slapping the north tip of Oahu Island. The plane flew into a brilliant Hawaiian morning. Oahu was beginning to stir. At Hickam Field, soldiers were washing a car. On Hula Lane, a family was dressing for Mass. At the Officers' Club at Wheeler Field, men were leaving a poker game. In a barracks, 2 men were in the midst of a pillow fight. At Iwa Mooring Mast Field, a technical sergeant was peering through the lens of a camera at his 3-year-old son. Hardly anyone had made it to the mess halls yet. Quite a few were still sleeping in their bunks in the warships, gently swaying in the harbor. Aboard the USS Arizona, an officer was about to suit up to play in the United States Fleet Championship baseball game. On deck, men were assembling to raise flags as a band played the national anthem, a Sunday morning tradition. Far above them, the pilot counted 8 battleships, the Pacific Fleet's full complement. There was a faint sheet of fog settled low to the ground. The pilot's name was Mitsuo Fuchida. He rolled back the canopy on his plane and sent a flare skidding green across the sky, then ordered his radio man to tap out a battle cry. Behind Fuchida, 180 Japanese planes peeled away and dove for Oahu. On the deck of the Arizona, the men looked up. In the barracks, one of the men in the pillow fight suddenly fell to the floor. He was dead, a 3-inch hole blown through his neck. His friend ran to a window and saw a building heave upward and crumble down. A dive bomber had crashed straight into it. There were red circles on its wings. Pete Zamperini was at a friend's house that morning, playing a few hands of high-low jack before heading out for a round of golf. Behind him, the sizzle of pancakes on a griddle competed with the chirp of a radio. An urgent voice interrupted the broadcast. The players put down their cards. In Texas, Louis was in a theater on a weekend pass. The theater was thick with servicemen, taking breaks from the endless drilling that was the life of the peacetime soldier. Midway through the showing, the screen went blank, light flooded the theater, and a man hurried onto the stage. Is there a fire? Louis wondered. All servicemen must return to their bases immediately, the man said. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. Louis would long remember sitting there with his eyes wide, his mind floundering. America was at war. He grabbed his hat and ran from the building.